Is the Bible full of contradictions? Three quick things to keep in mind.
All right, let's see it.
Number one, even if there were contradictions in the Bible, this wouldn't prove that Christianity is false.
So while I'm sure that is the rhetorical goal of many challenges to the dogma of univocality, that's certainly not the reason that I am challenging that dogma. But I will point out that if you imagine that every challenge to the dogma of univocality is an attempt to disprove Christianity, and you are an apologist for Christianity, that obviously means you're going to be beginning from a position of dogma, and you're going to have a much harder time actually thinking critically about the data you're engaging. And I think your use of the subjunctive mood in if there were actually contradictions in the Bible is indicative of that dogmatic stance from which you're engaging the question.
If you want to prove Christianity is false, you got to reproduce the body of Jesus.
So I don't know how one would be able to prove that a body were Jesus's body, and that standard seems to me to already be presupposing an awful lot of things about the narrative of Jesus's life and death in the Gospels. And also that certainly would not be the only way to disprove Christianity. But again, not the point of my engagement with this question.
And we can show Jesus rose from the grave even if there were contradictions in the Bible.
No, you can't. That's a dogma. That is not something that is supported by any data. That is a claim that directly contravenes everything we've ever been able to observe about the nature of life in the universe. So that's not saying I begin from the position that it's impossible. It's saying I begin from the position that that is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence, and you have absolutely nothing even remotely approximating extraordinary evidence for this event that would overturn everything that we have consistently been able to observe about the nature of life in the universe.
But second, keep in mind there's a difference between a contradiction and a difference. For example, the Gospel of Mark at the empty tomb reports one young man. Later Gospels will say there's two angels. That's not a contradiction because if there's two, there's one.
So the idea that this if there were two, there were one argument adequately resolves the ostensible contradiction in the Gospel's accounts of the resurrection, I think is symptomatic of one of the critical methodological flaws of apologetics, because the main rhetorical goal of apologetics is not to convince people who don't already agree. It's not to convince me. It's not to generate an argument that is valid for critical scholars. The main purpose of apologetics is to perform confidence and competence so that the people who already agree can be made to feel validated in that agreement. And because their worldviews and their self-identities are so entangled with the dogmas they want to be convinced are true, the evidentiary bar is lying on the ground, and so they do not require remarkably robust or sophisticated or methodologically valid arguments. They just need to be made to feel that the arguments are valid. And because they generally are not incredibly well informed about critical scholarship, you just have to simulate a valid argument. You don't actually have to produce one. So apologetics is primarily aimed at performing an argument that's good enough to convince non-specialists who really want to be convinced that the dogma is justified. That's the main purpose of apologetics. And so here we have this, if there are two, there are one notion. And try that in a court of law, where you have differing testimonies about how many people were robbing a bank or something like that. That's a context where you're expected to provide all of the relevant data and not omit relevant data. And with the Gospels, we kind of expect the same, don't we? I mean, at least the author of the Gospel of Luke says, I'm going to give you all the relevant details. And so for one to say, oh, there was one young man there sitting, and for another to say, well, there were two angels standing, like, that's not really reconcilable unless you retreat to the notion that a contradiction cannot be a contradiction unless and until you can and have conclusively demonstrated, prove beyond any reasonable doubt, that there is no logically or physically possible way for the two propositions to be true at the same time. That's a conceptualization of contradiction that is not standard, but is necessary for the performance of these arguments. But it's even worse than that, because the four gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus do not differ just in the number of angels. They differ in most of the narrative details. Let's take a look. Here's Mark's account. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. When they arrived to a tomb where the stone had already been rolled back. They encountered no one outside of the tomb, unless this narrator is profoundly negligent and incompetent. This narrator does not think they encountered anything out of the ordinary outside the tomb, because they go on. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him." Now let's go to Matthew. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Fair enough. We have consistency. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. Now I want to point out, this narrative, and suddenly there was a great earthquake, indicates that this was something that they witnessed. If they're giving background information and saying off in the distance, beyond their ability to perceive, this was going on, they wouldn't have said, "and suddenly." The "and suddenly" is internal to the narration of their journey to the tomb. That's how the Greek is to be read. His appearance was like lightning and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay." So here, according to the Greek of Matthew, the women see the cause of the stone being rolled away from the tomb. And then, before they enter the tomb, they encounter an angel sitting upon the stone that was just rolled away, telling them what's going on. Now, in order to reconcile Matthew and Mark, we have to imagine that these women are encountering multiple stations of angels who are going to scare them and tell them not to be scared. First on the outside, and then on the inside. And Mark was profoundly negligent to say, "Oh yeah, they went in and there was a dude sitting there." And they got, "Ah!" But according to Matthew, they were already freaked out by an earthquake and an angel descending from heaven and rolling the stone away from the tomb and sitting there and telling them stuff. These two accounts are not reconcilable, not plausibly. You could say, well, you can't say it's impossible, and that's debatable, but that demonstrates that the goal is not to actually generate a legitimate argument. It's just to try to gin up the tiniest little sliver of not impossible, and to live and breathe and have your being in that tiny little sliver of not impossible, because that's all your audience needs to feel justified in accepting that dogma. But wait, there's more. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. Wait a minute. We heard in Mark that they bought the spices after the Sabbath had passed. But according to Luke 23:56, they prepared spices before the Sabbath. And here it says they brought the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. So Luke agrees with Mark that the stone had already been rolled away by the time they arrived. And Matthew is the one who says they witnessed the stone being rolled away by the angel, the first angelic station that they had to encounter. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. So Mark said they went in and saw one man seated. Luke says they went in and were sitting there scratching their heads when suddenly there were two men standing beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to the hands of sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again." So Luke's account is entirely different. And I really think the notion that these women went from angelic station to angelic station and had to be terrified anew at each station as these angels told them the same thing each time is a pretty laughable way to try to resolve these contradictions. But wait, there's still more. We can go to John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. Wait a minute. The other account said the sun had risen, it was dawn. John says no, it was still dark. And this agrees with Mark and with Luke that the stone had already been moved by the time Mary arrived. But that's not what Matthew says. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then we get this story about Peter and the other disciple running to the tomb, looking in. Jesus is not there. There are no angels there, but Jesus is definitely not there. Then we go to verse 11. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And then Jesus tells her these things. So this account is entirely different from the others. The synoptics at least share some details, even as other details wildly contradict each other. But here, we have a totally different sequence of events. The angels never tell Mary anything. It is Jesus who reports on the events of his resurrection, which stands in direct contradiction to the accounts of the synoptic gospels, where the angels, either outside the tomb or inside the tomb, either sitting or standing, either after they have witnessed the stone being rolled away from the tomb or not, are telling the ladies these things. So in order to try to harmonize all four of these accounts, and I've never seen anyone attempt to say, well, here's the way it all happened. So these accounts cannot all be reconciled. I would love to see someone try to demonstrate that all of these details are inerrant and historical and happened exactly as the accounts stated. Because if you try to do that, you basically have to claim that all of the storytellers are profoundly negligent and incompetent because they are leaving out very, very critical details. And that's just so clearly not what happened. That is the result of prioritizing the dogma over and directly against what the texts are actually saying. You have to throw the gospel authors under the bus and say they were terrible at their jobs. But we can weave together this Frankenstein's monster of a sequence of historical events by imagining that everything they said was true. They just each omitted numerous details that they very clearly should have included. And we get this sequence of events that very obviously never took place. Even if we ignore the supernatural aspects, this whole, there's an angel, there's an angel inside, there are two angels standing next to us, and actually there was this whole event where these two dudes ran to the tomb in between all these things happening. And we saw the stone being rolled away, but we're perplexed about how the stone was rolled away when we first arrived here. The notion that that sequence of events took place is absolutely laughable. That obviously didn't happen. These accounts are obviously very different stories told at different times by different folks to different audiences for different reasons, and for that reason, they included very different details. They crafted stories that contradicted each other.
And third, what we do find in the Gospels in particular are agreement on the big issues, but the kind of disagreements we would find on careful eyewitness testimony.
So, loads of problems here. To begin, none of the gospel accounts is actual eyewitness testimony. Because even if we accept traditional authorship, and even if we take the gospel authors at their word regarding what happened, none of them claimed to have witnessed what Mary Magdalene and perhaps the other Mary experienced when they arrived at the tomb. At best, they're giving us secondhand testimony given to them from one or both of the Marys. But that doesn't result in four different accounts unless one or both of the Marys are telling the stories differently to the different gospel authors, or the gospel authors are altering the stories as they were delivered to them. So you do not get 4 accounts from 2 eyewitnesses unless things are changed along the way. And the notion that disagreements between eyewitness testimonies is evidence in favor of their truth is nonsense, because disagreements are contradictions. And so you've already given away the store. If they disagree, they contradict. And so you have to say at that point, well, they disagree because they perceive things differently, or they remember them differently. That's still contradiction. One or both of them is misremembering or misunderstanding or mispresenting the data. They cannot all be true. So then you've got to go to, well, they are all true. We just have to assume that one is giving one set of details and the other is omitting that set of details while giving a different set of details. So either those disagreements can be harmonized and they're not disagreements at all, they're just omissions of data from the narrative, or they are disagreements and they cannot be harmonized and therefore they are contradictions. So this type of apologetic approach is a kind of scattershot, throw the spaghetti against the wall, and hopefully the spaghetti will stick to somebody who needs to be justified by this. Because you cannot argue that there are disagreements and that's evidence of the truth of the testimonies, but there aren't disagreements because they're actually all true and they're just omitting details because they are awful storytellers. These cannot all be true at the same time. Either these stories contradict or they do not, and they very clearly contradict.
Contradictions or apparent contradictions don't raise the challenge to the Bible. Many people think it does.
Well, I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm not challenging the Bible. I'm challenging dogmas about the Bible. And what I have shown here is that dogmatic approaches to the Bible result in absolutely laughable attempts to rationalize those dogmas. And the fit for this video has been Adonai and his Asherah, which you can get at the Data Over Dogma stores in my link tree.